All right, let's get us started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nazila Jamshidi, and I'm a policy fellow with Andiana Foundation. And a little bit about Andiana Foundation. The foundation is a nonprofit think tank which is engaged in research and analysis on security, peace, and development issues. And this webinar by itself is a part of our ongoing series addressing a lot of regional challenges in Afghanistan, South Central Asia, and the Middle East. And on behalf of Andiana Foundation, I would like to warmly welcome all of you and our speakers, audiences into this webinar, which is titled If Authoritarian System Fracture, Gender Justice in the Moment of Political Transition or political change. What would happen to that? And we are especially grateful for our distinguished, very distinguished panelists who come with a wealth of knowledge and experience for taking time to contribute to this very important discussion. And it's such an important time. So today's conversation is grounded on a very comparative lenses. We are not looking at any one country in isolation, but we aim to examine kind of the patterns across Iran, North Africa, and Afghanistan to better understand how these gender justice evolve or regresses during moment of political change or aftermath of some of political change in the region. So the discussion will also contribute to our ongoing work, including policy article and forthcoming policy briefs that we are working on. And we really want this information and this very important insight to be sensitized in our policy brief and papers in future. So to begin, I would like to very briefly situate our today's discussion within the broader regional context. And of course, we have these distinguished panelists who are in a better place to talk about it. So if we look at this recent history, and by recent history, I mean last few decades, across Middle East and North Africa, there have been a lot of moments of profound political changes, and that could happen through mass protests, through reform processes, and also regime collapse. And also, as we have seen, there have been a lot of reshaping the trajectory of women's rights in those countries. And not only Afghanistan, which is quite a recent case, but in many other places. We have seen that in Iran, where ongoing protest movements continue to challenge the system. We have seen it in post-Arab Spring transition in Tunisia and Egypt, and also in Afghanistan, where the collapse of democratic institution in 2021 led to a very fast and quick dismantling of legal protection for women. And this brings us to the core policy puzzle, which will be guiding our today's discussion. So basically, our speaker will focus and will talk about why are women central to the movements for political change and yet excluded when power structure are redesigned or negotiations are happening. And what is that many profound political change bring about profound changes in women's rights and women's situation in the society. And of course, to explore this, we are going to look at three analytical dimensions, and our speakers are there to talk about it. I mean, we are going to look at the mobilization power, kind of the role of women they play in protest and political movement, the kind of an institutional architecture, how these law, constitution, and governance structure shape the outcome, aftermath of the revolution or political change, and also post-transitioning bargaining or negotiation, how these political negotiation can define whose rights are protected and whose right is not. So with that framework in mind, it's a pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Arash Azizi, historian and writer at Yale University, Dr. Evelina Ohab, an attorney and human rights advocate, and Ms. Elika Iftekhari, again an attorney and human rights advocate, and Ms. Spojmeh Akbarzeh, a development and policy professional. Welcome to today's discussion, and let's begin with you, Dr. Azizi, and with the first segment of our webinar today, which is on mobilization and kind of political participation. So, Dr. Azizi, in Iran, women have repeatedly played a central role in moments of political mobilization. During the revolution, 1979 revolution, women from diverse ideological backgrounds and groups participated very, very actively in the protests and contributed a lot into the change. Yet, in aftermath of the political change or revolution, so the new order introduced kind of a policies or laws such as that mandatory hijab law that significantly restricted women's rights. And also, I mean, more recently, as we all see, the women life freedom movement has again placed women at the center of the resistance. So my question for you is that why is that women often play a leading role in the protest movement, and then they lose influence when political decisions are made or a new system are put in place? What are the factors that help and to explain these kind of a pattern? And as you are providing insight, please feel free to touch on other countries of the region if you want. So over to you, Dr. Azizi.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. Great to be on the Anna Foundation, and really honored to share a panel with my friends here. So women have often played in modern Iranian history a key leading role in important junctions, as you mentioned. But this is particularly true actually in the last 20 years. And the reason for that is clear. The reason is there is a gap. There's a huge gap between the level of social advancement, sort of social sophistication, educational achievement of women in Iran and their place in the law. So you have Iran's female population, very educated with a long history of employment. Iran before 1979 had judges, it had female ambassadors, it had female cabinet ministers. And then all of a sudden, after the revolution, this situation changes. And, a lot of women are, of course, curtailed. But not only just women's rights are curtailed, but, you really have a system that treats women as second-class citizens. And we don't use these words lightly, like the imposition of mandatory hijab, laws that effectively may recognize husbands and fathers as male guardians, a bunch of other sort of Sharia rules effectively make second-class citizens. So this huge gap leads to activism. It would happen in any society. If you have the gap part is important because sometimes not every repressed population will become sort of necessarily politically active. Different things can happen, but when there's this huge gap between social attainment and social status, you're gonna have to see activism. So you've seen tons of activism parts of women, and I could say from 2009 actually, first time when women are really playing a major role in movements. That's not true necessarily. I mean, the women have played an important role in Constitution in 1905 and 1979, but there's a qualitative change in 2009 where you could see have a leading role. But that's also not true consistently. I'm not sure it's true, for example, in the 2017 protests in Iran, 2017-2018, which were based on outbursts on the street, and in some places sort of where there were not actually a lot of women involved, even if you look at the videos. But then of course we have the women life freedom movement where the very word Zan woman becomes part of the sort of ideology of this movement, and women have an important role. And of course they started all by fighting mandatory hijab. Okay, but it's an excellent question. I love your question because people usually just ask the first part, why are women so prominent? And then you can answer, oh, Iranian women are great and they have a role and they give the gap. But I think the key part is the second part to your question. I did not able to consolidate this sort of gains for themselves, and also we can have a regional look. The short answer, first of all, I mean they do sometimes consolidate the important gains. So let's first focus on that. Iranian women have made strides. If I point out to a few things. Well, first of all, of course, they've effectively beat back the regime on mandatory hijab. The regime is no longer enforcing the mandatory hijab. That's a huge achievement that came through a persistent years of activity and finally this mass movement. But it came through persistent years of activity. There was, the daughters of the Revolution Street. There were people taking part in Masih Alinejad's, SD Freedoms campaign and others, right? So, they are sometimes able to get important roles and important advances. And on other issues, let me just tell you one thing. In the 2024 presidential election in Iran, when Pezeshkian won, and there's a process that was free in any ways, but in the cabinet formation process, much the issue of gender representation was on the table. Iran did finally have another female cabinet minister, but the woman had forced this agenda on the powers that be. But let me just say this and finish here, which is that the reason this consolidation doesn't happen, it's not just about women, but in general, civil society organizations and civil society movements need to find a way to translate their needs and their public demands into durable political representation, i.e. become part of politics themselves. And that's something that hasn't happened on a huge level. And because the feminist movements that we're talking about and women's movements that we're talking about, part of civil society, they've suffered from the same thing. They haven't built durable organizations, haven't been able to translate, this sort of civic advances to political representation, which is entirely very difficult inside the Islamic Republic, of course, right? So there would need to be some sort of political transition for that. But in general, this translation hasn't happened. So it's part of a broader malaise of civic society activism in Iran.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Azizi. I think you point out a very, very important point. First of all, the gap between the level of social advancement and also women's place. And also you talked about the gap and kind of the translation gap among the civil society organization and some other factors. But let me ask you this follow-up question. So looking at Iran's historical experiences, you mentioned a couple of them. What lesson learned and what lessons, important lessons, if there are three, what they should be, what are those that we should draw about how political transition or change should shape the outcome for women?
Yeah, so let me count a few, and then you asked for regional examples also. Let me first briefly say that and then go to the three. Iraq is a very interesting example. When you had an outburst of feminist activism after 2003, after the fall of the Saddam Hussein's regime. Of course, our friend Yanar Mohammed, great leader of the Organization of Iraqi Women's Freedom, who was murdered recently in Baghdad after years of her activism. And Muhammad is an example. She was a communist activist. She started doing sort of women's activism openly in Iraq after 2003. She opened safe houses for women, published important feminist magazines and outlets, and really tireless activities. But we can see that she couldn't even protect her life at the end and was cruelly murdered. And how much of this demands and activism was codified into laws in Iraq, and into political representation in governance level? Not much. And part of the reason was this sectarian arrangements, where the sectarian leaders in different ethno-sectarian communities in Iraq came to rule things. Okay, so the lessons. One is that women's rights and women issues matter for everybody, and they're an urgent issue. Not, this is not a case, and I'm a man, obviously. So it's like the point of support for this is not that, I want to be ally and I want to help my sisters, or like the way people usually say. But no, it's important for the health of a body politic. It's important to have certain women's rights codified, woman representation guaranteed, right? So this is it's not a luxury, it's not a second-tier issue, and it's not a section issue. Not just an issue of, we just need women. And this is like, everybody comes with their different groups, come with their own little demands, and this is it. Women are also a group just petitioning for certain rights. So it's important for the health of a body politic as a whole. So it should be a priority for everybody. This is not true about every single political issue, frankly. So many political issues are important, but women's rights and women's representation really matter in this way. Number two is there should be codification, and one shouldn't be content as generalities and abstractions. Like, should be codification, changes in law, particular demands that are made by women's rights movements. They should be codified into law and not instead of general abstractions that we love our sisters and we're all good together and all that, right? So we need particular codifications. And the third one is that we need representation, and not just gender parity or sort of representation of people who happen to be women, but significant representation in politics, passing from, it's sort of a continuation of the answer I gave the previous one, from civic to politics, that there needs to be feminist, and I use the word feminist as shorthand. Other people might prefer other terms, but I mean as an advocate of women's rights in the context that we're talking about here. I respect that the diversity of terms are used in different concepts, but feminist rights advocates to develop a stateswoman and politicians, and advocate for political aspirations, and not just as individuals, and that's the key point, right? Not just as individuals, that you have one woman who happens to be like a really ambitious politician, and you make her minister of roads in case of Iran or others, right? But people coming from the movement, the women's rights movement needs to develop its own political cadre. People who think, and unfortunately this often doesn't happen. And in fact, the most terrible thing is that there's even a stigma against it. Some people would even go as far as basically saying, no, woman's job is activism, and they come and they let the male politicians do their thing, and they maybe put pressure on them. And I think that's and I think, again, this is not just about women. It's generally a question of, do you want to move from activism to politics, or not? And many people see the job of activists as just not being politics, right? Politics proper, governance and legislation, and I think that's important. So we need to develop political cadre.
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. The point you have just talked about, the three lessons, which are, of course, very, very important. But I should mention, we had cases of countries in the Middle East who came with a perfect law, with a very good law, with very good, good words and guaranteed on paper. And then, unfortunately, they got lost somewhere in the middle of the way, which we will get back to that. that, and we will talk about it a little bit more deeply. But now let me move to Elika Eftehari, who's another very, very impressive person, and her work is absolutely important in the especially her coalition building work is really impressive. So Elika Jan, you have worked very closely with a lot of advocacy organizations who are engaging in policy with policymakers and a lot of international institutions. And it's of course very, very important. So looking ahead, if political systems in the region began to fracture or reform or change or whatever, and we are not making any prediction, we are just talking generally, what role can the diaspora network and these international advocacy groups with whom you are in contact and policy actors, especially policy actors, and by policy actors I mean those multilateral organizations and think tanks and also policy and institutions, which we have a lot in Washington. What are the kind of a role that these institutions play in ensuring that women's rights remain central in the discussion and also after the political reform happened or after the political change happened, rather than just being sidelined? Over to you, Elika.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to share some thoughts. You know, I think that in the case of Iran, what we have seen since 2022, when the Women Life Freedom movement kind of erupted onto the scene, is a tremendous global kind of upswell in activity. Call it activism, advocacy, but really a kind of this glue came to exist that didn't really exist before, even allowed the opportunity for people to begin to discuss or form groups, to have ideas, to discuss different plans or avenues or ways to engage in advocacy. And so the first point I want to make is just how we have really witnessed something truly that is transformative, a true seismic shift with what political science analysts would call the black swan event of the death of Mahsa Jina Amini in 2022. I think that the second kind of point I think is worth our discussion today, or our consideration, is the fact that so often political transition, and as you said, whether it's a transition or fracturing, or we could call it instability, but let's presume any kind of environment like that, an environment where people are beginning to voice their opinions and ideas about what the future should look like in that environment, because these types of environments are reactive. They are reactive to the thing that is the present day danger, the present day harm, the thing that has been the focal point or the source of their oppression. And these environments are reactive to that. One of the things I think that we can be confident of is that, unlike in other instances, the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran is a really good example of one where women's rights had not been targeted and oppressed in a way before to have made people sensitive in that revolution to safeguarding it and treating it as the absolutely sacred and important and powerful energy within society that Arash was explaining that it is. And we won't make that mistake again. Why? Because everything since 2022 has been reactive to the systems that oppress, and those systems are all tainted with this oppression based on gender, this gender discrimination, which is why in Iran and Afghanistan it reaches the point that they qualify for a legal definition of gender apartheid. So that's the second thing I would say, is that I'm not afraid now that women's rights will be lost in the future of Iran and Afghanistan, because they have been the focal point of the oppression, and people are sensitive and sensitized and now understand and value those things because gender was so targeted in these environments. And I think the second part of your question pertains to advocacy. Was that right? And I'd like to draw attention to the difference between advocacy and its success and its outcomes, when that advocacy has sustained global attention and when it does not, or on any issue or any activity, movement, efforts, proceeding that can be influenced by global attention. That distinction of when you have that attention and when you don't is it can be just brutal, honestly, in terms of just objectively how much of a decisive outcome that can be in terms of how successful advocacy is. And I would draw such a difference between and look at how, unfortunately, oppressive regimes are constantly learning. Anytime that they've had a weak spot, a weak moment, something in their architecture that they didn't account for, they are moving to correct it. And so the Islamic Republic of Iran learned a pretty big lesson in 2022, which is what happened in 2022. And that Black Swan event, within 24 hours of Masajid Amini's death, her name was a viral hashtag around the world. Countries cutting their hair in foreign parliaments, standing there in solidarity with women life freedom, all of that. And what happened? The regime did not, as the UN fact-finding mission found, the regime did not go on a killing spree during that movement the way that it has since January of this year. Because of that global attention, it not only curtailed the worst form of violence that they engage in, lethal use of force, which now, under the curtain of darkness and an internet blackout, we know is the most severe kind, just shooting with machine guns into crowds at random. And so they learned that lesson, the regime did, which is why they have responded to these protests this year so differently. But I want to point out, I think I would say on advocacy, if we do a little more planning in our advocacy initiatives to identify places where we can extract or leverage that global attention and bring that into the pre-planning of building an advocacy campaign or an initiative, that would be a really, I think, a different way to go about things that would be helpful in these situations, for sure.
Yes, definitely. Well, with the momentum and global attention that you just talked about, it really requires sustained advocacy, sustained and very organized advocacy, something unfortunately sometimes get lost along the way. But I totally agree, momentum not always guarantee the global attraction and global attention. But let me ask you another question before we move to another speaker. So I understand you work with a lot of members of UN agencies and civil society, and you do a very good job with coalition building. I would like for you to talk about how does this go, especially at this time, to sustain this global attention? You talked about the environment and what is the environment that people react against it. So the environment is there, the global attention is more or less there, and a lot of goodwill is also there to bring about the change, and especially ensuring the place of women in future government, whatever it will be. So how do you see these mechanisms are working in your favor?
I think that coalition building, and I mean, are you looking for examples of how we've seen successful outcomes, or just kind of more theoretically how this all the pieces work together?
If you can bring a specific example, that would be better, because I'm sure audiences would like to hear about some example.
Sure. And, you had, so take, for example, the one that is so widely discussed and talked about. And I, really want I'm gonna die on this hill, which is that women life freedom is not dead. It's not over. It isn't a book that we closed and we put back on the shelf. Everything of today and today's moment is an extension of what popped, that bubble that burst with the killing of Massa Amini. And I say this, and I say this because there's been so much discussion about woman life freedom is over, or I've even heard it referenced as it failed. It, didn't achieve, like, I guess regime change is what they were looking back with in hindsight now is the topic. But I say that because when you look around at the connectedness of everyone, I can say that, for example, the connectedness of myself to the other speakers on this webinar arose when during the Woman Life Freedom Movement, because of the Woman Life Freedom Movement. So the interesting thing is that the coalition building, for that energy to even, for that wave to even begin to rise to the surface, it needs to, often it's triggered by some kind of cataclysmic event or some kind of momentous, or sense of urgency that like causes that to swell. So one issue with the advocacy is, do you even always get that energy? Does that energy, reach, and it's some kind of an obstacle? And for example, with Woman Life Freedom, it was met with a brutal crackdown. They just, what's the problem? Oh, they're on the streets? Get them off the streets, no matter what it takes. Just disappear them and shut it down. And then very quickly, we now have seen how much the regime has progressed in the past 2 or 3 years in terms of it doesn't even, and now with the benefit of the worst thing for the Islamic Republic in the 2022-2023 period, I think, regarding those protests was the global attention. So the coalition building initially, it needs that kind of some cause or trigger for the engine to begin to even run in the background. And I think I'm a big believer that that international and domestic advocacy should not be done separately, that they should be interwoven, interlinked, so that when you are going to Geneva and you are talking about refugee issues at the UN Global Forum on Refugees, that when you come back, your organization is part of another multi-organizational effort to have a congressional briefing 3 weeks later in the United States, to go meet with members of Canadian Parliament within a 6 weeks period. Why? Because why the timing doesn't matter, so that you are constantly, in order to get policymakers really their attention, they either need a burst of something like a cataclysmic event being covered on the media, or they need, and this is where the advocacy fills the hole, they need sustained, regular hearing it over and over. Look how the gender apartheid activists, people like Nazila, for decades they have been working, and it can take decades for your cause to become common parlance, to become a term that is now very widely known. And part of that too was the energy of the cataclysmic energy of what happened with Massa Amini and the U.S. withdrawal in 2021 from Afghanistan, the cataclysmic events. But those two things, international and domestic, really should not be done separately. They should be done in a very collaborative way. I think that we saw a great success stories with respect to advocacy for Iranian rapper and political dissident Tumanj Salehi when he was in prison. It's interesting to see the tools, even the ones that are in the realm of arts and culture, maybe not international affairs or political policy making, but just the award of a Grammy to an Iranian singer, or the award of the Havel Prize to Tumanj Salehi, the Iranian rapper. Those tools, even within the toolbox of international advocacy, the recognition, the giving of, recognizing the Woman Life Freedom Movement, a peace prize to an Iranian political prisoner, that type of recognition-based, those tools from the international community, those help tremendously. it doesn't really cost them anything to give out these awards, but it injects a dose of media coverage and attention to help keep, there's so much that they can do that doesn't cost a dime, and that policymakers can actually use to influence and shape how things, evolve, how things play out actually.
Awesome, definitely. I totally agree on that. We really, truly need sustained long-term advocacy, strategy, and also, of course, the environment and events that cover the media. But now let's move to next speaker, who will, Ms. Esbojme Akbarzeh, who will speak about Afghanistan, which provides a clear example of how women's rights can shift dramatically with political changes. I mean, following the 2004 constitution, I mean, significant gains were made. And I always say that I myself am a product of that 2004 constitution. And back in 2021, many of those gains were rapidly reversed. So, Esposh John, in your opinion, so what factors do you think, I understand you work a lot with women, and you are working with a lot of women from different diverse ethnic groups and linguistic group, so you have a huge familiarity with entire the trajectory and discourse. So what factors in your opinion can explain these very sharp shifts? And I mean, 2021 was not the only shift we have seen in women's life. What are the accounts for persistent gap, or this persistent gap between grassroots mobilization and sustained political influence? Tell us about your own experience, and how do you see the reason?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Nazila John, for putting together this insightful discussion. As you rightly mentioned, the 2004 Constitution was one of the finest de jure document in the region, but it included institutional mechanisms, it included rights protection, it also had tremendous amount of rights secured and guaranteed for women on paper. But the actual problem lied in the enforcement of those laws enshrined in the Constitution. And I can give you an example of the elimination of violence against women law. The elimination of violence against women law, and there are many articles on it for the reference. The elimination of violence against women law was introduced to the parliament, but it never got passed. Why? Because the legislative, which was part of the constitution of Afghanistan since 2004, the same element from the Legislative Assembly contradicted passing the elimination of violence against law. One of which is Qazi Hanafi, who very conspicuously said that good women don't need any law. And not only men, but surprisingly, the women who obtained seats through quota, the same reservation that was guaranteed in the Constitution, they also started contesting this law, and they didn't want to be passed. And it remained as a presidential decree until the fall of Afghanistan in 2021, which means that there was a significant gap between what was written on paper and how it was enforced. And it shows, and again, it's my personal opinion and perspective, that one of the major hurdles here was the donor-backed state building. Most of the times, the state building efforts were not institutional, but very programmatic. Again, the same EVA law was supported by the embassies, supported by the civil society organizations, which were backed by international community, but those laws were still alien to a jihadist who turned to become a member of parliament Hanafi. And he still didn't want this to be passed, and he still didn't want women to have the right to speak out or stand out or against the domestic violence or any sort of gender-based violence. And the second most important and by far the main factor for elimination of women's rights after the fall of Kabul was the exclusion of women from the negotiations and political settlement. So if Nazila Jan, you and I, we will remember we were in school when we heard that First Lady Laura Bush said that the war on terror is a war for the liberation of Afghan women. And that was the time, since 2001, Afghan women were securitized in the sense that their rights matter, their existence matter, their dignity matter, their freedom matter. But it continued until 2013, and under the name of nation building. It continued supplementing and supporting civil society. It continued supplementing and supporting selective urban-centered institutions. But when in the 2013, when the shift came from supporting Afghanistan in the national system in Afghanistan to continuing negotiations with the Taliban, the desecuritization of women started right away. In a single shift, the Afghan women had started to be desecuritized by the United States, surprisingly, and the entire international community. Because in 2018, when the Doha deal negotiations started, the international United States, backed by the international community, had openly said that Afghan women's issue is an intra-Afghan discussion. And they started taking the women's rights agenda off one of the most important political negotiations in the settlement. This could be expected from the Taliban, obviously, but the United States and the international community surprised Afghan women. And if you hand over the entire country and then you pull off the entire support from Afghan women and the people of Afghanistan entirely, then obviously the people in power today could shape any sort of discriminatory gender normative. And that's what's happening in Afghanistan, in today's Afghanistan.
Yeah, with that, I agree. I mean, with all the points, and especially I remember when the peace talk, Doha peace talk was about to start, women across Afghanistan, they raised voices and they say, we want a seat around the table of negotiation. And they did a beautiful job. They came up with several campaigns and they were able to mobilize significantly across the country. But also, I mean, if we look at Afghanistan history, 2021 was not the only major shift that happened in women's life. It happened in the past, I mean, over and over. And even with the civil society, which we built, and in my opinion, we managed to build this robust civil society during 20 years of reconstruction and development of the country. And they were the kind of the source that I was always looking at them. But even look at them, I mean, with the collapse of government, they couldn't resist in even one day. They kind of collapsed immediately. Of course, they are reemerging now. We shouldn't forget about that. They are reemerging in different corners of the world, and they are doing amazing work, especially with the advocacy. But even with that, I mean, we were not able to sustain those development in the establishment of civil society. So do you think there are some internal factors also that are contributing in it, whether it's the women group themselves or the social norms or ideological beliefs that exist in the country? I would like for you to talk about that also.
Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly, that the reforms which were introduced during the 20 years of Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, they were selectively centered to some of the major cities. Some of the major cities grasped the reforms, while the rest of the country, majority of which was under the Taliban's shadow governance, did not experience any sort of reform. The level of awareness was very low in majority of the provinces in Afghanistan. The engagement was very low. The state did not introduce policies in those provinces. For instance, I'll tell you about, I can give you an example of a province like Helmand. In Helmand, the situation was completely securitized. There was a constant clash between the Taliban and the international forces. Imagine a woman living in Helmand. What priorities do you think she would have? Her priority is survival. It's not an extension of women's rights. The first thing she can remember living under the bombshells is how she can survive, how that woman and her family can survive. And I also, we submitted a research to Raoul Wallenberg Institute last year, and we did some case studies under which we found out that even the state and international community did not for once bother to introduce any sort of reforms to those provinces. So that's one of the major internal factor, and also coupled by the patriarchal norms. The patriarchal norms in those provinces. We have one of our grantees. I don't want to divert the discussion. One of our grantees mentioned that the Taliban ordered women in Helmand province to wear double burqas, not one but double burqas, just because they don't want the Taliban gaze to be attracted by that women. It's that level of oppression that women in some areas of Afghanistan are facing and experiencing.
That's true. Thank you so much, Espoir-Mejan, to share all this information. Afghanistan definitely is not unique in terms of like post-revolution or post-political change regression in women's life, but it is kind of unique in terms of factors that contributed to the situation. And I think it's such a good transition to move to our next speaker, who's Dr. Evelina Ohab, and who's an international law attorney and who can talk about international tools and means available. So now, well, we have talked about a couple of cases so far. We talked about the factors that led to the sidelining in the aftermath of political change. And I think, I mean, it's such a good time to move to you, Dr. Ohab, and touch on these international law and tools. And I understand you talk about it a lot, and you have trained a lot of good advocates on these international tools. So from a human rights perspective, gender equality is most of the time as part of public demand during many of these protest movements. But again, as we have been talking about, it have been sidelined by in the elite negotiation and when the political restructuring. So, Dr. Ohab, what international legal frameworks or tools exist to ensure women's rights are protected during the transition or after the political change, whether they are wanted or unwanted by the negotiator groups? So how they can be protected under, and if there are any legal framework or international tools that help us. You can touch on Afghanistan issue because I understand you are very much involved with the campaign of gender apartheid and the case of Afghanistan. Over to you, Dr. Ohab, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Nazila Jan, for organizing this important session and also for looking beyond one country and looking into few different countries. And before I will answer your question, I just wanted to make a few comments in relation to what other speakers said, because it's very much, the presentation was so powerful. And among others, Dr. Azizi talked about the need to prioritize women's rights. And should be priority for everyone. And I would just add everywhere as well. And I joined you today from London, from the UK. And one would think also that women's rights are adequately protected, but every single day we hear stories about domestic violence, domestic abuse, femicide, and other issues that require attention. And unfortunately, I think no country in the world can claim that they're on top of the issue. And of course, each country, each region will have other challenges, but nonetheless, we are still far from where should be in 2026. And this is a very, very sad realization. And recently I started working on the issue of domestic abuse here in the UK as well. And also issue called drug-facilitated sexual assault, which is on the rise right now with so-called online rape academies where men teach each other how to abuse women and how to get away with it. And there are already cases in France, in Poland, in the UK, and this requires attention. So whenever we manage to tackle one issue, there is something new that is discovered that requires attention. And again, this is something that I sometimes struggle to deal with, that we are so far from seeing equality in the law, seeing equality in the lived experiences of women and girls around the world. And Elika Jan mentioned something very important as well about the cataclysmic events that normally trigger some kind of change, but we always have to wait for this kind of events to see the change. And this is again very, very sad. But what is even worse is that whenever we see this kind of events, we see some international engagement, some responses, and then we forget about it. And then we wait for yet another event. And of course, we can talk about the horrific cases from Iran. But another example that I have in mind is the issue of abduction of women and girls by Boko Haram in Nigeria. And everyone would remember the case of Chibok girls, because of course the international community took this case and have been advocating for the release of the girls. But since that case, there were thousands of girls abducted by Boko Haram, and we rarely hear the stories, let alone we see any kind of response to the atrocities against women and girls in Nigeria. So we do not learn from this kind of experiences, those cataclysmic events that indeed trigger some change, but it's normally short lasting. And I've been working, of course, on the situation in Afghanistan, but also Iraq, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and many other countries. And also because Dr. Aziz mentioned Iraq, just wanted to briefly, and especially the killing of a wonderful human rights advocate there. And in Iraq, we also see a U-turn on women's rights. And just a few years ago, there was this new law that was the personal status law that was adopted, and which ultimately legalized child marriage and enabled, or some interpretation of the legislation suggests that girls as young as 9-year-old can marry, which is again a massive U-turn. In other parts of the world, in the Gambia, we see still push to decriminalize FGM, which is of course violence against women and girls. So we see this kind of U-turns all over the world, and it requires urgent attention and responses. And so this is just my brief reflection, because it's again very difficult to come to terms with everything what is happening, and with, of course, then foreign aid cuts, with so many important initiatives supporting women losing their funding, not being able to support women and girls in different parts of the world. We will see more of this kind of U-turns on women's rights, unfortunately. And I think we are still not understanding the real price that will be paid as a result of it. I think in the short term, governments see it as a positive development in terms of they're saving money on foreign aid. But in the long term, this is going to cost a lot, the whole international community as a whole. And again, we, at this time, we don't see it yet, but unfortunately we'll see it, and people will pay ultimate price for it, unfortunately. So this is, again, very grim realization. And now I will talk about law. And again, law can take us only to a certain point, but unfortunately, law is not the response to every problem that we are discussing today. And of course, we have many important international legal frameworks and treaties that are to protect women's rights. And we are not talking only about treaties that are specifically focused on women's rights, but we need to talk about all tools in the toolbox, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A declaration, so of course not legally binding, but ultimately, of course, parts of it. And many experts argue that it is part of the customary international law, and we need to treat it as such. And it was introduced on the as a result of just following the Second World War and the horrific atrocities that we've seen. And it was meant to be the response to ensure that we don't see this kind of atrocities ever again. And we can, of course, spend hours and hours discussing all the situations that we've seen where atrocity crimes were committed, and of course where women's rights were denied, and again, women paid horrific price as a result. Of course, we can talk about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and you mentioned Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a party and acceded to it back in 1983. We can talk about the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and punishment, and several other treaties which have this much broader focus. But then, of course, we have a very important convention, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, which was an important mechanism to oblige countries to uphold women's rights and to ensure that women's rights are adequately protected. And again, this Afghanistan is also a party to CEDAW and ratify the convention back in 2003. And I would need to double check with Afghanistan whether there were any reservations. I don't think so, but I'll give you a very brief example of this important mechanism being ratified, but one country introducing so many reservations that it actually doesn't mean anything. And it's indeed Iraq. When Iraq became a party to CEDAW, made so many reservations that preserved inequality between men and women, preserved the right of men to ultimately punish women as well. So unfortunately, countries and states globally managed to find ways how to get away around this kind of provisions. And we are talking only about those provisions as they are written on the paper and as countries are ratifying or acceding to them, accepting the binding obligations, but ultimately, of course, without much effect. But law, again, can take us only to a certain point. And of course, it's all about implementation and enforcement of those laws, where that's yet another hurdle. So even if countries accept those obligations, how do they implement them? How do they domesticate them? How do they enforce them? Which, again, depending on the country, will become a challenge. And of course, we know on some wonderful examples, including from Afghanistan, how Afghanistan introduced various mechanisms to give effect to its international legal obligations during the Republic time. But of course, all those mechanisms has now been dismantled. And of course, we've been hearing about all those different provisions introduced to restrict women's rights and make a massive U-turn on Afghanistan's international legal obligations and the implementation. Something else what I wanted to mention is, of course, apart from the law adopting and accepting the legal obligations, implementing them, enforcing them. There is the broader problem. Legal obligations, international legal obligations, are accepted by states, a group of people who run those states. But what about the general public? And again, in order for any kind of international legal provisions to have meaning, to be able to ensure change on the ground, it is key to ensure that there is outreach and education on those provisions. And nothing is going to happen, nothing is going to change unless we also educate the general public. And I will tell you about one important initiative that was introduced here in the UK, but it's a declaration for of course all countries in the world, that had a great potential, but unfortunately it never went anywhere. In response to the horrific atrocities that the Yazidi community experiencing, especially Yazidi women and girls who were subjected to horrific atrocities by Daesh back in 2014 and subsequent years, including the use of sexual violence in conflict, the UK government has been working with victim survivors to create this important declaration called Declaration of Humanity, which was meant to engage religious leaders or leaders of religion or belief to ensure that they participate in this important outreach and educate people as well, and challenge narratives that justify the kind of abuse that the Yazidi women and girls suffered. The Daesh fighters between themselves and their communities somehow managed to persuade that the abuse of the Yazidi women, including sexual violence in conflict, was justified by Quran. And nobody challenged it. People just accepted it, took it as the truth. And indeed, the Declaration of Humanity was meant to address this kind of situation. So again, engage leaders from different communities, especially religious leaders, that they challenge this kind of narratives and ensure that misinformation, disinformation of this sort could be addressed as soon as possible. And the UK government launched this initiative a few years ago. Unfortunately, it was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So of course, it was an online launch, outreach, possibly not as we would want to see it. It was signed by many religious leaders from different parts of the world. But unfortunately, again, it did not get the attention it required. And its effect has been very much limited as well. And after the horrific atrocities against the Yazidis, and even with the launch of the Declaration of Humanity, we've seen similar atrocities being perpetrated in different parts of the world. And of course, we can talk about several of them, and this kind of sexual violence in conflict, but also outside of conflict situations. Sexual violence during atrocity crimes continue to be perpetrated to this day and continue to be justified. And unfortunately, no one is challenging this kind of narratives justifying such violence. Maybe last but not least, of course, apart from the human rights framework, we can talk about the international criminal framework that we have, and especially the the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, with limitations, of course, because it's also binding upon state parties to the Rome Statute. So we have a little bit over 120 of them. But again, Afghanistan is a state party to the Rome Statute, and is bound by the provisions of the Rome Statute, which ultimately means that the courts in Afghanistan should, the prosecutors and the courts should investigate and prosecute the international crimes committed in Afghanistan. As you may remember, after the case was initiated at the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor initially, or the court initially, stopped the proceedings, allowing the courts in Afghanistan to do the investigations and prosecutions at the time, arguing that, of course, they need to be given the time and the opportunity to do this work themselves before the ICC actually steps in. And as the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and as it became very, very clear that there will be no investigations and prosecutions, that's when, of course, the prosecutor of the ICC applied to revive the case. And indeed, at this stage, we have 2 arrest warrants against 2 leaders from the Taliban leaders for gender persecution as crimes against humanity, which is a very important case. But ultimately, of course, it is not going to proceed until those two Taliban are in The Hague, and then, of course, face justice and accountability. But the ICC and of course the Rome Statute and what it actually requires states to do is such an important mechanism to also enforce women's rights. A different kind of mechanism. We need to talk about violations of women's rights as international crimes, and of course, gender persecution is one of them. But something that rarely is talked about, and again, I will go back to the issue of the abuse of religion to justify the denial of women's rights, including in Afghanistan, is very much the crime of religious persecution as crimes against humanity that needs to be looked into as one of our tools in the toolbox. And there's a lot that we can learn from another case that the ICC was looking into, and that's the case of Al-Hassan, where the charge of religious persecution succeeded while gender persecution did not succeed. And I think studying this case shows us also that it is not enough for us to focus on one charge, one crime, but we need to look into all of them. We need to look into torture. We need to look into so many other types of crimes against humanity to ensure that women in Afghanistan see justice and accountability, or a glimpse of it, because what the ICC can do for Afghan women is very much limited as well. And if there is time, I can also talk a little bit about enforcing women's rights, also using the principle of universal jurisdiction, because we've seen really important cases over recent years, especially in Germany, when, again, in the case of the Yazidi genocide, we've seen courts prosecuting Daesh fighters for genocide, for the horrific atrocities that women have been subjected to by Daesh. But happy to answer any other questions, but I will stop here.
Well, thank you so much, Evelina. Thank you. And I totally agree that we are still so far from where we should be in terms of international human rights law. And also I should mention the whole international human rights law regime is quite young, and we need a lot more development in terms of that. So, but let's move to the next segment of our webinar. I'm going to have another round of questions for all speakers, and then we open it up to audiences for receiving questions and then responding by our speakers. And if each speakers can summarize their responses within 3 minutes, that would be very much appreciated. So let me start with you, Elika Iftikhari. I mean, and again, let me go back to these recent movements, particularly in Iran. I mean, they have drawn a lot of significant attention, as you talked about it earlier. So in practical terms, what impact those attention has had on the whole movement? What have been the important impact on those so far?
I think I really appreciate this question, because it gives me another opportunity to just emphasize how stark the difference in outcomes is when you have that attention, whether it's a strong burst for a short but powerful enough period of time that you get some kind of an outcome, or that long, sustained, slowly built, hard fought, sustained advocacy. It's the example I want to give is, you may have seen, all over social media for the past several weeks, people inside, to the extent they're able to connect and get their messages out on the inside of Iran, and people outside of Iran and the diaspora, everyone has been talking about, where are the Starlink? Where did all the Starlink go? Where did all the Starlink go? And there hasn't seemed to be good in-depth coverage of what's the status of these Starlink people. We know that there were at times estimates of 100,000 possible Starlink inside of Iran. And the case of how the Islamic Republic strategically used the UN body, the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, in order to bring a complaint it was done very quietly. There was it was one place where there wasn't the global attention that there had been elsewhere in other aspects of what was going on in 2022, 2023 during the woman life freedom movement. And very quietly, the Islamic Republic brought a complaint. And in October 2023, this UN body that is tasked with a mandate of promoting global international connectivity among all peoples, in 2023 issues a ruling that finds that the presence of the Starlink in Iran that had been brought there for human rights purposes to be able to give the people a voice, the presence of that violates the Islamic Republic, violates Iran's digital sovereignty. And so this complaint has opened up this new can of worms, so to speak, regarding the issue of digital sovereignty. What does it mean? But when this order came out, not only did the International Telecommunication Union not only find in favor of the Islamic Republic and find that it had a right to dismantle any Starlink that it found, and those Starlink were illegally operating inside of Iran, it told the United States and Norway that they should work with the owner of Starlink to get the Starlink to comply and withdraw their Starlink out of Iran. And so I believe I cannot say that I think the outcome of that finding or that decision would have been different if there had been sustained massive global attention. But do I think that aspects of the analysis and the policymakers' treatment of the issue and the decision makers and the judges or the participants in the ultimate ruling that came out, do I think that they would have been forced to grapple with certain issues? Absolutely, if there had been global attention. And so that gives you an example. Meanwhile, in a place where you do get sustained global attention, is look at the success, relatively speaking, of the UN fact-finding mission on Iran. It was given a mandate. That mandate was extended once. And the second time, not only was the mandate extended a second time, it was broadened on top of that. And it has made a finding of crimes against humanity. It has become a source of an authoritative international Western voice on the status of human rights in Iran. And so that was a tremendous, but that emerged out of tremendous global attention. Meanwhile, the treatment of Starlink in Iran and their quiet disappearance is a result of the lack of global attention.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing with us those. Thank you. I wish we would have more time to speak about that because it's a current event happening right now and it requires, deserve much more global attention. So now let's move to you, Dr. Azizi. You are a historian and across the region, I understand you talked about it a little bit earlier. We had different institutional factors come into the play. So if we look at kind of comparatively kind of across the cases, different cases in Middle East, including Tunisia, Egypt, Iran, we see very different, of course, outcomes for women's rights after political change. For example, in Tunisia, post 2011 constitution included a lot of good laws and in terms of gender equality provision. So, and in Egypt and Iran, women were kind of marginalized in political restructuring process, and you talked about it, about the factor. So from comparative perspective, which institutional factors matter the most in shaping these different outcomes? Will it be constitutional guarantee, judicial independence, political party system, whatever it is? What are those? Over to you, Dr. Azizi.
Yeah, thank you very much. Few of my fellow panelists rightly pointed out how law is not enough, and yourself pointed out that law is not enough, and it can be a piece of paper. Nevertheless, it does matter. No, your question is which institutional instrument, I guess, is the most important. I point out to two, and I said already said two before, which I think constitutional guarantee can matter, right? Things in the constitution matter. Now, we know, as the example of Iran, my favorite article in the Iranian constitution is inquisition is illegal. You can't, but obviously, it happens all the time. So it's the law it does not just get realized magically once it's written on the paper, but I think it does matter. And we have Dr. Wahab here as an expert on law, obviously, and I very much associate myself with her attitude and her comments on this issue, and I learned a lot from them as well. So I think we all agree that law matters, but it's not enough. Secondly, that I think is important. I think it's executive bodies, is the presence of women and politicians committed to women's rights on executive bodies that are actually implementing, and also bureaucratic structures, right? That there should be durable bureaucratic structures committed to these goals that have a civil professional function, and so not, that they're not, it's not something that you put on one day and then you take it the other day. But look, we have to always remember something at the end of the day, that obviously sort of primacy of politics. Look, if Taliban are going to run down and take everything down, Taliban are going to run down and take everything down. Doesn't matter what great institutional design you had, right? So, I think, these institutions matter, but unfortunately, no institution is no institution is so durable and strong as to be able to withstand any and all political change, right? So at the end of the day, safeguarding them really matters as well. So I hope that's clear. Basically, I'm saying three things really. So constitutional change, executive body representation, and bureaucratized, bureaucracies, durable, impersonal, to be very Weberian about it, bureaucracies.
So, well, yes, all those three are very, very important. But let me ask you this: which of those were lack in Revolution 1979, or in the current cases of Arab Spring, or in the cases of Afghanistan? What are some of those factors, the important factors we talked about, were lacking in these major events?
Well, in the case of Iran post-1979, all the three were lacking. You did not have good constitutional guarantees for women's rights. You did not have dedicated political cadre to women's rights to come in positions of power, and you certainly did not have really bureaucracies dedicated to women's rights. Incidentally, the women's movement in Iran fought for all three in the years to come, including those who had come from within the regime, right? Including Islamist women in the regime who went through a transformation, and it's an interesting story of itself. Many of them pushed for similar laws, for similar changes. In terms of Tunisia, look, Tunisia did have very important advances, I think, and I think some of them have kept to this day, frankly. So some of the legal changes, some of the legal changes have not been taken back. But look, what you had was, and this is a very fascinating point of conversation, with the resumption of power by Said in Tunisia, you had basically an authoritarian power grab, and this authoritarian power grab will overcome the two other points. First of all, it would make law meaningless because the rule of law is not there, so whatever is in the law, the government will do what it wants. But also, obviously, the executive was different. It's now him and his people in charge, and bureaucracies have been. I don't think they've been. And I'm not a close observer of Tunisia, but I observe quite a bit, and I don't think they've been able to undo everything, right? So people like Monica Marx, my friend who specializes in Tunisia, have noted some durabilities, although more and more things are taken away. So these three things are important, but that doesn't mean that there is no way to undo them, right? So I think that's the key point here. There's no guarantee in life, unfortunately. What you really need is to solidify what does it look like? You solidify a constitutional guarantee that is then solidified to political guardianship and bureaucratic institutions that won't easily change with political wins. But I mean, that's a tremendous task. And I mean, Taliban in Afghanistan, again, that was a case of, well, the Taliban never fell to the Islamic Republic, and it wanted to bring down this republic from the outset, and it finally did. So the question is, why did the republic fall? Is the question that obviously observers of Afghanistan and people of Afghanistan have been dealing with for some years. But ultimately, it's because it did not have enough a strength to be able to withstand the Taliban pressure, and this was very clear from the very outset. If like 2005 or 6 or 7, it was clear that, and of course, then it lost its American support under President Trump. It's true that they left under President Biden, but it was under President Trump that negotiations with Taliban began, right? So, nothing can withstand that. I don't think that's... So basically what I'm trying to say is I don't think this shows that, even if you have all of this, there is no guarantee. There's never any guarantee for life. You could also have a fascist coup in France next week and, everything can collapse. But it's much less likely than other countries because the settlements there is more durable.
That's true. Well, thank you so much for talking.
And can I just say something? In the United States also, we have a good case of course, let's say abortion rights were thought to be guaranteed. If you ask anyone 5 years ago, 6 years, I mean, I remember people I don't need to say if, I remember people made fun of me when I said during 2016 elections that abortion rights are not guaranteed and they could go away and they will go away in your lifetime. People, I'm 38 now, so I was, it's a very relevant issue for people of our age. Like, that people we're talking now, it might come a time where it's illegal for you to have an abortion. And that it happened, right? It happened because of elections and inside democratic structures. So there is no guarantee for things. Politics never stops.
Sure, there are a lot of factors contributing. And I mean, Dr. Azizi talked about internal and institutional factor. And now I would like to ask Dr. Ohab to talk about international safeguard that are that could be or are most effective in protecting women's rights during kind of fragile transition. Talk about those, please, Dr. Ohab, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nazila Jan, and of course, international mechanisms and international law again can take us only that far. And as Dr. Azizi said, law is important, but we need to ensure that there are mechanisms that can actually implement and enforce this the law. Otherwise, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. And just a very brief example of the Genocide Convention, which imposes, of course, duties to prevent and punish, but it's a toothless convention. It does not provide avenues, especially for victims and survivors on the international level. Of course, states can bring proceedings against the state accused of genocide before the ICJ, International Court of Justice, but victim survivors don't have this kind of right. There is no treaty monitoring body attached to it as well. So victim survivors are very much limited in what they can do to enforce their rights. And this is also a very important message, especially as we are talking about the Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity right now. Again, imposing important duty to prevent and punish crimes against humanity. But if it does not include a treaty monitoring body, again, there will be very limited options how to enforce it, and that will limit its effectiveness. And then, of course, international law. It does not mean much if it's not implemented, and if it's not domesticated by countries. It has to, that's the next step. And again, it will take a very long time. The way in which it is implemented matters as well. And again, depending how it is domesticated by states will ultimately define whether and how victims, survivors can enforce their rights. So there is a lot that needs to happen. So we can talk about, of course, the important international legal commitments, but what they are, what are the monitoring or other mechanisms ensuring their implementation and enforcement? How do they translate into rights on the domestic level? And then on the domestic level, again, how can they be enforced? We can talk, of course, about constitutional protections, but again, without them ultimately, without avenues for justice and accountability on the domestic level to enforce them again, this will ultimately mean that this limits what victim survivors can do. And I remember you mentioned also the question in relation to independent courts as part of this, as part of ways in which we implement and enforce international legal protections. Very, very important. And without it, ultimately victims and survivors of whatever wrongs cannot do much. But again, what are the avenues for victim survivors to engage courts? And I'll just give you a brief example, going back to the issue of the Genocide Convention, and for example, how it is adopted and domesticated in the UK. In the UK, there is one provision, of course, criminalizing genocide, very important, but there is very limited that victim survivors can actually do to enforce it. The government's position, it is for courts to make a determination of genocide, but there is no avenue, for example, for victim survivors to apply to court for this kind of determination and analysis being done. So we normally rely on external courts. For example, in the case of the Yazidis, it was first after a German court recognized the atrocities as genocide, the UK government followed this recognition. That was 9 years after the horrific atrocities against the Yazidis. And we see this also affecting the way in which investigators, prosecutors are dealing with the issue of genocide in this case, because of course we are talking about genocide. And indeed, until now, there have been no investigation, prosecution of Daesh fighters for international crimes such as genocide before British courts, even though some 400 of them returned to the UK. They're British citizens and they are within the provisions that should ensure investigations and prosecutions. So it's all interlinked. We need international commitments, international law with strong enforcement mechanisms, yes. We need domestic implementation or domestication of those provisions and the implementation enforcement, yes. We need clear avenues for justice and accountability for victims so that they can trigger those mechanisms and those protections as well. And again, talking about the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, there's a lot that we need to be calling for, including the treaty monitoring body for that should be included in the draft treaty. That was there, I believe, when the treaty was first drafted. It was removed later. But there's a lot we can learn from the bad example, or from the very negative example of the Genocide Convention without the treaty monitoring. The positive messages or positive lessons from, for example, the Crimes Against, the Torture Convention, which has treaty monitoring body, which provides victim survivors with extra avenues for justice and accountability. This is key, especially if there is no political will to engage on certain situations. And victim survivors cannot rely on politicians and how politics play off in order to exercise their rights. So we need more victim-centric mechanisms.
Absolutely, absolutely. Completely, totally agree with that. So let's ask the last question from our last speaker, Espojmejan. Looking back, we talked about institutional protection before that have been made in Afghanistan system. I mean, if looking back at everything, and especially these institutional protection, what could have been made to the system to make it a little bit more resilient? And I understand you talked about some factors before, but what are really, I mean, 2021 was not the last transitioning or last political shift in Afghanistan, was not the first and will not be the last. So what are the factors that we really need to learn from them in future planning for transition?
Thank you so much, Nazila John. I think the timeline didn't do the justice. We only had 20 years, and within those 20 years, the process of democratization was like for a few years we had the transitionary period, and in the transitionary period, with the collapse of the former Taliban regime, we entered a republic era and started institutionalizing and establishing in building institutions and making sure every right, or we are ratifying the conventions. Afghanistan fortunately did not have any reservation with the CEDA convention. And so first 10 years was a kind of a transitionary period. It took time to establish institutions. It took time for us to establish Ministry of Women Affairs. It took time for us to make sure that the quotas that have been enshrined in the Constitution are enforced, and we have enough representation for women. So once you shift from authoritarian regime to and enter into a democratic regime, you also need workforce, you also need human resource. We needed time to equip women with the skills required for running for the parliament, learning how to monitor everything in the parliament, learning how to work around the different technicalities in a legislative body. And then the second decade was a consolidation decade. And in the consolidation decade, unfortunately, the international community, who was the donor for every single institution, started supporting United States in talks with the Taliban. And once the Taliban agreed to the conditions, the so-called conditions that we don't know what they are, agreed to the United States condition, Afghanistan was handed over to the Taliban, and it was a political decision. Women's rights agenda was not included. They were there, the representation was there, but the agency wasn't. For women during the talks, they said it multiple times openly and also in closed door discussions that there is very less for them to engage. The opportunity is not given, and more than anything, the special peace envoy, Mr. Khalilzad, he was the one who decided everything with the Taliban. And then women were excluded. Exclusion is not that you tell women get out of the room. Exclusion is when you don't when you don't engage them, when you shake hands behind the scene, and then you just bring women for visibility and giving them a symbolic representation. This is what happened with Afghanistan. And I think we lost the opportunity. We lost that opportunity, and it's not reversible. We cannot bring back that time. But what we can do is at this point is a very meaningful time and in a completely important juncture for Afghan women to come together as a collective and help building coalitions. Bringing their shared and common interest in the forefront, and leave back their sub-identities and work for the recognition of gender apartheid. I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We are a little bit over time, and I wish we would have more time to talk about this. But unfortunately, I have to conclude this conversation. But to conclude the whole webinar, I just want to highlight three key takeaways that came up from our today's discussion. First of all, women's central role in mobilization doesn't automatically translate into political power. And our speaker beautifully talked about a lot of factors, a lot of tools, a lot of instruments that can make that happen. Second, an institutional design is critical in determining whether rights are sustained or reversed. And we talked about several examples by our speaker. And third, comparative analysis shows that outcomes are shaped by the combination of domestic structure and international engagement, of course, and especially the public, general public that our speakers talked about, that is very, very important. So today's discussion reinforced that political transitions or change are not just the moment of change. They are the moment of an institutional decision making that shape long-term trajectory of gender justice. And by that, thank you again to our speaker to brought to the table a lot of good information and experiences and a lot of studies here and share with our audiences. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for taking time and being part of this very, very important conversation. We look forward to continuing this conversation through our upcoming policy work. Thank you.